Have you ever considered the small pieces that make up your life? A childhood memory, a clumsy phrase, a faded photograph. Sometimes those pieces don't quite fit together. We tell ourselves they're just minor flaws, stories that have been retold incorrectly. But what if those pieces were evidence of a larger, more horrifying truth? A truth that has been hidden for years. A truth that could shake the very world you live in. This is the story of a woman named Sarah. Her ash-blonde hair was often neatly tied in a bun, and her deep blue eyes always held a look of quiet composure, as if she had seen a world no one else could. Sarah wasn't a dramatic character or someone who sought attention. She was just an ordinary woman with an ordinary job in a small suburban library. But in the quiet late-night hours, when the books were neatly arranged on the shelves and only the ticking of the grandfather clock echoed in the room, Sarah was haunted by an image. It was the image of a little girl drawing chalk flowers on a sidewalk. The flowers weren't brightly colored, just white. The child had golden hair and wore a striped dress. The child's face was unclear. Sarah didn't understand why this image kept lingering in her mind. It wasn't like any memory she had, yet it felt strangely familiar, like a long-forgotten dream. Sarah grew up in a small, rural community called Peaceful Valley. Despite the name, there was a strange atmosphere there. Everyone lived under the guidance of a man known as Father Jaxon. He wasn't a priest in the traditional sense, but everyone worshipped him as one. His word was law. His voice echoed through every corner, from the simple wooden houses to the dry cornfields. Father Jaxon had a charismatic appearance, with graying hair and sharp eyes. He always spoke of purity, innocence, and the sinful outside world, a place he called the Dark Land. Every child in Peaceful Valley was raised the same way. They learned how to farm, cook, and worship Father Jaxon. They were not allowed to have contact with the outside world. No TV, no phones, no internet. Their lives were an endless cycle of labor and prayer. Sarah never thought there was anything unusual about this life. For her, it was the only world she knew. The older women in the valley, who were called the sisters, told her that the outside world was a place full of temptation, where her soul could be corrupted. But deep inside, a small voice always whispered to her. That voice began with small questions. Why weren't there colorful cars like the ones in the old books Father Jaxon kept hidden away? Why weren't there planes flying in the sky, just birds and white clouds? Everyone told Sarah that those things were products of the imagination. But she didn't believe it. As she grew up, those questions became bigger, deeper. One day, when Sarah was 18, she was assigned by Father Jaxon to work in the old shed, where the community's old belongings were stored. The shed smelled of dampness and mold, with dusty boxes stacked high. While sorting a pile of old, crumbling books, a small wooden box fell, and something rolled out. It was an old silver locket, tarnished and scratched. When she opened it, she saw a tiny photograph. It wasn't a picture of Father Jaxon or anyone in Peaceful Valley. It was a picture of a young woman with long brown hair and a radiant smile. She was holding a little girl. What stunned Sarah was, the little girl looked exactly like the child who haunted her thoughts. The child had golden hair and wore a striped dress. Instantly, Sarah felt a jolt run down her spine. It wasn't a dream. It was a memory. That small photograph was a ray of light, illuminating a dark corner of her mind. Father Jaxon had always said that her parents died in a tragic accident when she was a baby, and that he had taken her in. But why was this photograph here? Why was it hidden in a shed? Father Jaxon's story no longer fit with what she held in her hand. Sarah carefully hid the locket in her pocket. She decided she had to find out the truth. After that, Sarah began to notice other small details in the valley. She noticed that the older women often bowed their heads lower than usual when Father Jaxon walked by. She noticed that the stories Father Jaxon told about the outside world always had a suspicious exaggeration. But most of all, she began to see the fear in the eyes of the valley's residents. A fear she had never truly recognized before. That fear was not just for the outside world, but for Father Jaxon himself. One evening, Sarah snuck out of her house. Her heart pounded in her chest. She walked toward the forest behind the valley, a place Father Jaxon always forbade everyone from entering. He said the place had evil spirits, but Sarah knew there was a secret trail leading out of the valley there. She had to go. She had to find out what the outside world was like, and if there was any truth to the stories she had heard. She had to know who the woman in the photograph was, and who the child in the photograph was. She had to find out about her real family, about the life she should have had. The leaves rustled under her feet, and the sound of a night owl echoed. Sarah looked back, where the faint yellow lights of Peaceful Valley were fading. She was leaving the only world she knew to step into a world she had never seen, a world she had been taught was hell. She didn't know what she would find there, but she knew she couldn't live another day in a world built on lies. Tears streamed down her cheeks. They were tears of fear, but they were also tears of hope. Courage is a small flame, easily extinguished by fear. But for Sarah, that flame had been ignited by an old silver locket. She walked for hours, crossing the dark forest, her feet bruised and tired. The smallest sound made her jump. She was used to the silence and false security of the valley, and the real world outside was too loud and scary. Finally, she saw light. Not the light from wooden houses, but the blinding light from street lamps. It was a completely different world. Sarah stood stunned before a wide asphalt road, with cars speeding by like steel monsters. She felt lost and alone. She had been deceived by Father Jaxon her entire life. Everything he said was a lie. The outside world wasn't a dark place, full of demons. It was a vibrant, colorful place. A place with smiling brown-haired women and glistening cars under the lights. Sarah had escaped, but she didn't know where to go. She had no money, no ID, no one to turn to. She only had the silver locket in her pocket. It was the only thing connecting her to a mysterious past. She followed the road, trying to avoid the cars and the curious eyes of the drivers. Finally, she saw a small gas station, with an elderly woman sitting at the counter, reading a newspaper. She had neatly tied gray hair and gentle eyes. Sarah gathered her courage and walked in. The smell of coffee and gasoline was strong. The woman looked up and smiled. "Hello, dear. Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was so gentle, so kind. It was something Sarah hadn't heard in a long time. Sarah didn't know how to answer. She just held out the locket, her hands trembling. "Do you know this woman?" Sarah asked, her voice a whisper. The woman took the locket, looking closely at the photo. Her eyes widened, and the smile on her lips faded. She looked at Sarah, then back at the photo. "Oh my God," she whispered. "She's Lisa." She turned back to Sarah. "Who are you? How do you have this?" she asked, with a look of astonishment. Sarah told her the story of Peaceful Valley, of Father Jaxon, and of how she found the locket. The woman, named Margaret, listened with a horrified expression. Margaret said that Lisa was her niece, her sister's daughter. Lisa and her husband, David, had disappeared 25 years ago, along with their small daughter, Elizabeth. Margaret took an old piece of paper from under the counter. It was a missing persons flyer, yellowed and creased. On the flyer were pictures of Lisa and David, along with a picture of a little girl, Elizabeth, with golden hair and deep blue eyes. Sarah's heart stopped. She looked at the photo. It was an exact match for her as a child. The golden hair, the blue eyes. The picture on the missing persons flyer was identical to the little girl in the tiny locket photo. Sarah was Elizabeth. Lisa and David were her real parents. They hadn't died in an accident. They had been kidnapped. Margaret explained that Lisa and David were investigative journalists, and they were looking into a new cult in the countryside. That cult was Father Jaxon's. They had written an article exposing his illegal activities. Before they could publish the article, they disappeared. The police searched everywhere, but there was no trace. Everyone assumed they had been killed by Father Jaxon. But Father Jaxon hadn't killed the child. He had taken her back to Peaceful Valley and renamed her Sarah. Sarah went into shock. Her whole world collapsed. She wasn't Sarah of Peaceful Valley. She was Elizabeth. She had a family, a real family that had been searching for her for 25 years. They had lived in pain, thinking she was dead. Margaret cried, hugging Sarah. "Welcome home, Elizabeth," she said. Margaret called her sister, Lisa's heartbroken mother, to deliver the news. Lisa's mother was old and frail. She had never stopped searching for her daughter and granddaughter for 25 years. The news of Sarah's return sent shockwaves. Her family immediately came to pick her up. They were kind, loving people. They hugged her, crying, as if they were embracing a ghost who had returned from the dead. Sarah still felt lost. She didn't remember them or her childhood. She felt like a stranger standing in the middle of a strange family. But they didn't care. They only cared that she was back. The police were notified. Sarah, or Elizabeth, told them everything about Father Jaxon and Peaceful Valley. They launched a major investigation. They searched the valley and uncovered many horrifying secrets. Father Jaxon had scammed, abused, and manipulated hundreds of people. He had built an empire of fear and lies. But Father Jaxon had disappeared. He had escaped as soon as he heard Sarah had left the valley. Elizabeth's life changed completely. She was taken to a safe place where she could begin the healing process. She met her loved ones, her parents' old friends. Everyone told her about Lisa and David, about their brave and loving personalities. She began to piece her life back together. She wasn't a forgotten woman. She was a woman who had been found. However, a feeling of emptiness remained. She still wanted an answer to a big question. What did Father Jaxon do with her parents? Death is a release, but disappearance is a torment. Elizabeth's family had endured 25 years of torment. While her return was a miracle, it reopened an old wound, an old question. Where were Lisa and David? Sarah, now Elizabeth, decided that she couldn't live in peace until she found the truth. The police had announced that Father Jaxon had escaped, but Elizabeth knew it couldn't be that easy. He was an old fox, a master manipulator, and he surely had a backup plan. Elizabeth began her own investigation. She went back to Peaceful Valley, but this time, she wasn't a scared woman. She was a woman with a mission. She walked through the old wooden houses where she had lived her whole life. She looked into the eyes of the valley's residents, the people who had once been her family. She saw confusion, fear, and a hint of guilt. An elderly woman, who had cared for Elizabeth when she was a child, came to see her. Her name was Esther. Her hands were shaky, and her eyes were cloudy. She cried, begging Elizabeth for forgiveness. She said that Father Jaxon had threatened her. He had told her that if she revealed any secrets, he would harm her children and grandchildren. She told Elizabeth that on the night her parents disappeared, she saw Father Jaxon and a few other men take them away, blindfolded and tied up. They were taken somewhere in the wasteland behind the valley. It was a place Father Jaxon often visited, and he had told everyone that it was a sacred place. Elizabeth found an old, hand-drawn map of the valley in the shed where she had found the locket. It had a small, mysterious symbol in the wasteland area. It was a symbol Father Jaxon had taught everyone was the symbol of the sacred. Elizabeth knew that was where she had to go. She hired an elderly man who lived nearby, a man with a metal detector who had once worked in the mines. They went to the wasteland, a place full of dense trees and large rocks. They searched for hours. Elizabeth felt hopeless. Maybe Father Jaxon had killed them and buried them somewhere where they could never be found. But then the man's metal detector started beeping. It was a weak signal, but it was there. They dug. Under a large rock, they found an old, rusted iron box. When they opened the box, they found something more horrifying than death. There were old documents inside. There was a handwritten letter from David, Elizabeth's father, talking about what had happened. He and Lisa had discovered that Father Jaxon was not just a cult leader. He was an international child trafficker. He had kidnapped children, falsified their documents, and sold them to wealthy families abroad. Elizabeth's parents were targeted because they knew too much. The letter also contained a small, hand-drawn map leading to a secret hideout of Father Jaxon. The hideout was not in Peaceful Valley. It was in an old house in a distant town. The letter ended with a hopeful sentence. If anyone finds this, please tell our daughter that we love her very much and never stop searching for the truth. This letter was a message from the dead. It was irrefutable evidence. Elizabeth had found the truth, and the truth was more horrifying than she could have imagined. She wasn't the only victim. She was one of many children Father Jaxon had kidnapped and sold. The police immediately took action. They found the old house and discovered a secret underground cellar where Father Jaxon was hiding. He was arrested. Elizabeth went to see him in prison. He had grown old, his face was wrinkled, and his eyes were no longer sharp. He still tried to deceive her, saying he was a good man, that he had saved her. Elizabeth just looked at him, not saying a word. "Where are my parents?" she asked. He gave her a sinister smile. "They've been dead for a long time. I did what I had to do. The outside world, it will never accept you." Elizabeth knew he was lying. She looked into his eyes, and she saw a look of pure terror. He was afraid of her. She was a reminder of his past, of his crimes. She turned and walked away. She didn't need to know where they died. She had enough evidence. She returned to Peaceful Valley. The residents there were now living a new life. They had been freed from Father Jaxon's control. They had started learning how to live a normal life. Elizabeth had become a symbol of hope and courage. She had become an accidental hero. She had done what everyone had once been too scared to do. She found the truth. Time is a wonderful healer, but it can't completely mend every wound. Months passed. Elizabeth, who had now fully accepted her real name, began to rebuild her life. She went to college, studying journalism, following in her parents' footsteps. She lived with her real family, who loved and cared for her. She visited the graves of her parents, who had now been found. Although Father Jaxon never revealed exactly where they were buried, the police found them in a shallow grave in a remote forest area, near Peaceful Valley. Elizabeth never forgot her past. She had a stolen childhood, a hidden life, but she didn't let those things define her. Instead, she used her story to help others. She founded a non-profit organization to help victims of cults and missing people. She became a strong voice for the voiceless. One day, she received a letter from a young woman. She said that she had seen Elizabeth's story on TV, and she had recognized herself in the story. She had grown up in another cult, and she also had pieces that didn't fit in her life. Elizabeth reached out to her and began helping her find the truth about her family. She not only found her own family but also helped dozens, hundreds of others. She had become a symbol of hope and resilience. Elizabeth found meaning in her pain. She turned her loss into a source of strength, a source of inspiration. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. She fought the darkness of her past, and she won. She not only found her family but also found herself. Life is not always fair. Sometimes the most horrible things happen to the best people. But what matters is how we deal with those things. We can let them destroy us, or we can turn them into our strength. Elizabeth's story is a reminder that even in the darkest moments of life, hope always exists. We should never stop searching for the truth, and we should never stop loving. You've joined us on Elizabeth's dramatic journey to find the truth. We are very grateful for your attention. If you found this story meaningful, please hit the like button to support us, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on other fascinating stories. Be sure to hit the notification bell to stay up to date with our latest content. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.